The morning of April 6th, 1945, began like a whisper over the East China Sea. A pale, golden light crept across the horizon, spilling over the rolling waves, and the dark silhouettes of American destroyers stretched thin across the radar picket line. The air was still, too still. Sailors stood on deck, squinting toward the distance, their faces carved with exhaustion and instinct. They had been here before. They knew what was coming. Okinawa, the final doorway to Japan itself, had turned the Pacific into a furnace. Every man aboard those ships understood that survival today was not guaranteed. Some whispered prayers. Others simply checked the barrels of their 5-inch guns, loaded and ready, eyes fixed on the radar screens glowing in the dim light below deck. Then, the silence broke. A faint beep on the radar, then 2, then 10. Within seconds, the screen lit up with hundreds of contacts, blips multiplying like a swarm of angry hornets, all heading straight toward them. The officer of the watch shouted, "Incoming bogies, bearing 040." Alarms erupted. The metallic hum of engines roared to life. Men sprinted to their stations, hearts pounding against their ribs. This was it, the kamikaze assault everyone had feared. From the north, the first Japanese Zero broke through the morning mist. The rising sun gleamed on its wings, the red circle blazing like a wound in the sky. Behind it came dozens more, bombers, fighters, planes stripped down to carry only fuel and death. Each pilot had been told his mission was divine, that dying for the emperor would turn him into a god. But this morning, something would happen that none of them, not even the most loyal, could have imagined. Because below them, inside the barrels of those American guns, hid a secret so small it could rest in the palm of a hand. A secret that would shatter their faith, their mission, and the very sky itself. The first volley erupted, thunder rolling across the sea. And as the shells soared upward, something invisible began to awaken. It would change the course of the battle, and of war, forever. The first explosions ballooned above the ships, not in random bursts, but in precise, terrifying patterns. Instead of tearing blindly through the clouds, the shells detonated midair, surrounding the incoming Japanese planes in sudden storms of shrapnel. The pilots didn't understand. From inside their cockpits, they saw flashes, hundreds of them, and then the world fractured. One Zero disintegrated before it ever reached the ocean's surface, wings snapping off like paper. Another was torn apart mid-dive, its fuselage vanishing in a halo of smoke and flame. To the American gunners, it looked as if the sky itself had turned against the enemy. "Direct hit," someone shouted. But no one had seen the shell make contact. That was the strange part. There wasn't any contact. Beneath the deck, in the gun control room, a chief petty officer grinned as he watched the data flicker. "VT fuses," he said quietly. "She's doing her job." "VT," a young sailor asked, his hands trembling on the comm switch. "Variable time," the man replied, tapping the glowing screen. "Radio proximity fuse. She knows when the enemy's close and blows herself to hell before they even get near." Above them, the battle raged. The air trembled with the whine of engines and the hiss of flak bursting in perfect rhythm. Japanese pilots tried to maneuver through the chaos, but it was like flying through an invisible minefield. They dove, climbed, banked, and exploded. For the first time, the legendary kamikaze waves began to falter. The sacred wind, kamikaze, the divine storm, was colliding with something it couldn't comprehend. On board the destroyer USS Cassinyoung, a lookout watched through binoculars as 1-0 burst into flames just 50 yards from the ship. He whispered, almost in disbelief, "They're dying before they even reach us." And still they came. For every plane that fell, 2 more appeared from the haze, engines screaming like banshees. Each pilot carried a photograph, a letter, or a prayer cloth tied around his neck, small relics of the life he'd left behind. They had been told that death would cleanse the shame of surrender, that their sacrifice would halt the American tide. But now, in those final moments, what they saw wasn't divine light. It was steel, fire, and the impossible precision of modern war. On the decks below, sailors reloaded the 5-inch guns, sweat running down their faces despite the cool morning wind. The rhythm became mechanical. Aim, fire, load, repeat. Each shell carried within it a pulse of invisible energy, a miniature radar transmitter that sensed when death was near. And when it did, it answered with thunder. By mid-morning, the sky over Okinawa was a black haze of smoke and falling debris. The ocean burned, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan's most fanatical weapon, human sacrifice, had met something even more unstoppable: science. By noon, the sky above Okinawa no longer looked like the sky at all. It was a living storm, smoke, oil, and ash swirling in chaotic layers. The air tasted of burnt metal and salt. Every few seconds, another explosion rolled across the sea, echoing between the ships like the heartbeat of something monstrous and alive. Below deck, the smell of cordite clung to everything. Gunners worked like machines, their faces coated with soot, eyes bloodshot from hours of firing. Their ears rang with the endless rhythm of war, the crash of shells, the shriek of sirens, the distant roar of planes dying mid-dive. Above them, the sea burned. A Japanese bomber had struck the USS Bush, setting her decks ablaze. Another slammed into the USS Colquhoun, breaking her spine in two. Even with the miraculous new fuses, some kamikazes slipped through. Not many, but enough to remind every man aboard that no technology was perfect. No invisible shield could stop desperation. From the bridge of the USS Cassin-Young, Commander John B. Sweeney watched a flaming Zero plunge into the waves barely 100 meters away. The explosion lifted a wall of water high into the air, drenching the crew. Sweeney wiped his face and muttered, "They don't even blink." He was right. For every pilot who died before reaching the fleet, another followed, fearless or perhaps already dead in spirit. Some had taken off from Kyushu with their landing gear welded shut. They had no way home. They were ghosts long before the first shot was fired. In the Japanese formation, a young pilot named Arita Mori held his plane steady, his hands shaking over the control stick. He had seen his commander's aircraft vanish in a flash of orange fire just seconds earlier. The blast had ripped open the sky itself. No direct hit, no visible bullet, just light. He didn't understand it. No one did. All he could think was that the gods had abandoned them. Still, he pressed forward. The ocean below was littered with burning aircraft and oil slicks that shimmered like molten gold. His fuel gauge trembled near empty. He whispered his mother's name once, then throttled up. The cockpit rattled. The world turned white. From the deck of an American destroyer, the gunners tracked him silently. A single shell left the barrel, arcing into the sky. It didn't need to hit. It only needed to feel him. 20 meters from impact, it detonated, a perfect sphere of flame and steel. The plane dissolved instantly, nothing left but ashes and wind. When the smoke cleared, sailors cheered, but it was a hollow sound. They weren't celebrating victory. They were witnessing the moment when courage met annihilation and vanished. While the skies above Okinawa burned, half a world away, few men truly understood why. Inside a windowless building on the American East Coast, under military guard and strict silence, a small group of scientists listened to radio intercepts of the battle. They weren't soldiers. They didn't wear uniforms or salute. But their invention was rewriting the laws of combat in real time. The project had begun years earlier, before the world had plunged fully into madness. It was called VT variable time, but those who worked on it knew its real name, the proximity fuse. It was the weapon that could see without eyes. At the start, few believed it was even possible. The concept sounded absurd, a shell that could sense when an enemy aircraft was near and detonate automatically without a direct hit. In 1940, that was science fiction. But in a small lab in Maryland, under the direction of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, a physicist named Merle Tuve decided fiction wasn't enough. Tuve's team had no luxury, no sleep, and no room for error. Each prototype was built by hand, tiny vacuum tubes assembled inside casings that had to survive the brutal acceleration of being fired from a naval gun. 20,000 GS of force in an instant. If a single wire snapped, it was useless. If it failed to detonate, it risked giving away the Allies' greatest secret. They called it the most delicate miracle of the war, and it was guarded like one. Even the gunners aboard American ships didn't know exactly what they were firing. They just saw the markings, VT, and followed orders. Only the highest-ranking officers understood what those letters meant. The secret was so important that the fuse was never used over land, for fear that a dud might be recovered by enemy forces. It was deployed only where the evidence would sink deep into the ocean. By 1945, the weapon had evolved beyond theory. It had already turned the tide in Europe, defending London from the deadly V-1 rockets that rained down like mechanical locusts. But the Pacific was different. Here, the enemy didn't use machines without pilots. They were the machines. Men turned into missiles, and the VT fuse was about to meet them. When the reports reached Washington, hundreds of kamikazes destroyed before impact, no one cheered. In the quiet offices of the Navy Department, Admiral Ernest King simply stared at the figures on his desk. He knew what it meant. The future had arrived, and it came wrapped in copper and glass. The war was still raging, but something irreversible had happened. The machine had surpassed the man. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. Night fell over Kyushu like a curtain of ash. The surviving pilots landed in silence there, engines coughing smoke and salt water. Some never spoke again. Others stumbled out of their cockpits in tears, not from fear, but from shame. For the first time since the dawn of the kamikaze program, their sacrifice had failed. In a wooden operations hut near the southern coast, Commander Matome Agaki stood before a fading map, his fingers tracing the red lines that marked that morning's attack. 200 planes sent. Barely a handful returned. He could hear the soft hiss of rain outside, mingled with the faraway thunder of distant guns, the war creeping ever closer to home. They died without reaching the enemy, whispered one young officer. Agaki said nothing. His face was stone, but inside, the old samurai spirit was breaking. He had promised his emperor that the divine wind, kamikaze, would sweep away the invaders just as it had the Mongols centuries before. But this time, the wind had met something it couldn't cut through. Something invisible. Something godless. In the pilot's quarters, 20 men knelt before a small altar, the faint glow of candles trembling in the draft. Photographs of mothers, wives, and children lined the walls, paper talismans fluttering in the damp air. One of them, a boy no older than 19, whispered to another, "They say the Americans have a weapon that explodes in the air like a spirit that hunts us." The other nodded slowly, eyes hollow. "The gods have chosen a side," he murmured. Agaki entered the room. Every pilot stood and bowed. He looked at them, boys dressed as men, faces pale under the flickering light. He wanted to tell them the truth, that bravery alone could not defeat invention. That faith, no matter how pure, could not stop the advance of science. But his voice failed him. Instead, he said, "Tomorrow, we fly again." The next morning, before dawn, they pushed the planes out onto the wet runway. The engines roared to life, echoing like distant thunder across the fields. Each pilot carried a small white scarf tied around the neck, a hachimaki, symbol of purity and resolve. They bowed toward the rising sun, unaware that the horizon they faced was already owned by the invisible hand of the enemy. As they lifted into the gray sky, Agaki watched from the ground, hands clasped behind his back. He had taught them that death could be a weapon. Now he understood the truth. It was not death that frightened the enemy. It was precision. For centuries, Japan had believed the divine wind would always protect its shores. But on that morning in 1945, as the first explosions flared in the distance once more, the wind finally died. By the end of April 1945, the sea around Okinawa had become a graveyard. Wreckage drifted across the waves, fragments of planes, splintered wood, twisted metal, and sometimes the quiet stillness of a life lost. The air reeked of oil and salt and smoke. For weeks, the sky had burned without rest. On the decks of the surviving destroyers, men stood silently as the smoke cleared, staring out at the horizon. They had won the battle, but few felt victorious. The kamikazes had struck with a fury no machine could match, and yet, one by one, they had fallen to a weapon they never saw. News of the success reached Washington wrapped in coded telegrams. Admirals congratulated their men. The Navy called it a triumph of innovation. But in the quiet rooms where the scientists met, there was no celebration. One of them, Merle Tuve, simply stared at a spent VD shell on his desk, a small, polished casing that had changed the course of history. It worked, someone said behind him. Tuve nodded, his expression unreadable. Yes, he whispered, maybe too well. In Tokyo, the report from Okinawa arrived like a death sentence. Even before the Americans set foot on the island, Japan knew the war was lost. Factories lay in ruins, fuel was scarce, and the sky, once their shield, now belonged to the enemy. The divine wind had been broken by invisible hands of logic and electricity. And yet, beneath all the destruction, something deeper had shifted, something human. For centuries, men had gone to war with swords, rifles, and courage. Now they fought with circuits, signals, and math. Courage had met its limit. Precision had taken its place. When Okinawa finally fell in June, the ocean was silent again. But in that silence, the world had already changed. The same minds that built the proximity fuse would soon be called to work on another secret. One that would not just end battles, but entire cities. A weapon of light. A fire beyond imagination. The atomic age had begun. For the sailors who survived, memories of that spring would never fade. They would remember the sound, not of impact, but of detonation without contact. The sound of an invisible frontier opening. The day when men first realized that death could be delivered by unseen forces, guided not by eyes or hands, but by thought itself. The divine wind had once been a symbol of faith and destiny. But over Okinawa, it meant something colder than disbelief, precision. The gods of war were no longer carved from stone or worshipped in temples. They were built from circuits and glass, humming quietly inside a shell no larger than a man's fist. And that silence would echo louder than any explosion.